So this is information on what I perceive, in other words, I'm sharing a lot of my experience, cybersecurity challenges during presidential transitions. Why? Because America is in the midst of a big presidential campaign. It will decide the course that America takes for the next 4 years. So it's interesting to look at it and then figure out how our services operate during this time, because it is different. So let me, there we go. Every 4 years, we have this turnover or renewal or whatever. No president can serve longer than, I think it's 2 terms. So if you have any president that's in for 2 terms, at the end of 8 years, that president is gone. You can't say, oh, well, you know, like Vladimir Putin, he's been there for years. You can't do that in America. We actually have legislation that says president after 2 terms, gone, replaced, new president. And so as we're doing this, how do we become aware of services that may be needed, suggestions or, you know, requirements that are coming down the pipeline? This is sort of unique, and that's why I want to bring it up. But if you think about it corporately, there are some similarities. So, very quick diversion. The government of the United States. Can anybody tell me what type of government the U.S. is? Anybody? Jim, Connor? Connor, you've had your civics or social studies. What type of government is the United States?
Is it a democratic republic?
A democratic republic. Right out of the book. That's exactly right. A lot of people say, well, we're a democracy, but that's not true. We are a republic. And the reason why, and we'll sort of go through that, if you take a look at this, in the Pledge of Allegiance, it says, and to the, it doesn't say to the democracy. It doesn't say to the nation. It says to the republic. So you're exactly right, Connor. As we're thinking about it, and it's also a federation of states. And what that does is it gives the federal government overarching management and control, but then underneath that are the 50 states that have local authority that is vested to them by being within this federation. That's why if you go to Arizona, and I'll use that as an example, you can drive 75 miles an hour on our freeways, but if you go to Maryland, for example, it's only 55 or 60, because the states have decided individually what is best for them. So that's what characterizes a republic. All right? So let's talk about the Electoral College. A lot of people don't understand the Electoral College, and they basically say, why don't we just say whoever gets the most votes wins? The challenge to that is there are states that are very heavily populated, like California. California is a monstrous state. And if you took like California and New York, and there's a couple others, but if you took the 5 largest states, those 5 states by themselves contain more people than the other 45 combined. So what that means is, if we were a pure democracy, the only people that would be elected president would be from one of those 5 states. Think about it. So just something as we're talking about it, the Electoral College helps to prevent that. It helps to give individual states the ability to be part of the electoral process. And each state, based on the number of members they have in the House of Representatives, they have what are called Electoral College votes, or delegates, I think is what it's called. So California, being a big state, gets 55, but Pennsylvania gets 20, Ohio gets 18, Georgia gets 16, and you know what? Those add up to around the same 55. So it allows the smaller states to have representation even at the presidential level. So I thought that was important. A lot of people say, well, let's abolish the Electoral College. Well, if we go to a straight democracy, we don't need states. It's important to think about because the federal government will run everything. Not federal government, it would be the Democratic government would run everything. They would tell you in Butte, Montana, what your speed limit is. They would, you'd have a driver's license that would work everywhere. Not a state driver's license. You'd have a a democracy driver's license. So that we are what we are. Okay? So be careful when people say we're a democracy. They're not speaking in true understanding that we are a democratic, like Connor said, a democratic republic. So very good. So let's talk about the executive branch. These are often called the U.S. Cabinet. And you see photos of the president with a whole bunch of people sitting around this great big beautiful wooden table, and that's the president's cabinet. The cabinet involves the secretaries of a number of different agencies or departments they're called, and other things like Homeland Security, Department of Commerce, Health and Human Services, etc. And they form the presidential cabinet. They are the executive branch of the U.S. government. And when you have a new president, that means you're going to end up with lots of changes throughout the executive branch leadership. So that's why I put that on there. So something to consider for transitions as we're talking about it. The number one thing is the timelines are inflexible. Regardless of what happens with the election, you are going to have a presidential inauguration on January 20th. Your election is what? This year it's November 6th, November 4th, whatever it is. January 20th is when everything changes. So you've got between that date and this date to get everything figured out. There's also strict segregation. Let's say you have won the presidential election, President Chris. The issue is that until Inauguration Day, you're not the president. You've won the election. You are the president-elect, but you aren't the president. You can't, they don't give you keys to the White House. You are basically in line to become the president on Inauguration Day. And, oh, by the way, that means you have a lot of things to do, but you don't have access to the president's stuff. You don't. Another is funding. The government has set apart money specifically for the federal government transition during presidential transitions. There's money out there to help pay for what are called transition teams. If President Chris gets elected, he's going to start hiring people to help ease the transition of him into the office that's being vacated by Joe Biden. So that's what the transition team is there to do. It's not like a brand new employee arrives. You say, okay, here's your timesheet, clock into the time clock, okay, now what? No, you've got to assume the reins while this stuff is still in motion. So that's why there's a transition team. And you get larger and larger and more powerful until the day when everything changes. And that's something else to consider. Challenge number 4, security clearances and access control. It's a big deal because, like I said, you, as the president-elect, aren't the president. That means you can't get into the president's stuff. Even though you're the president-elect, you're not the president. And the outgoing person is not gone yet. They're still the president. So security clearances, they have to go through, remember I said November to January, those security clearances have to occur within that time frame, and they have to be able to grant you a security clearance or grant you what's called an interim clearance. Or you don't get into that position, and that has happened. If they can't give you a security clearance, you can't be the Secretary of whatever, like the Department of Defense. The Secretary of Defense has to have a security clearance. Regardless of how popular that person is, they have to have a security clearance. And if they don't have everything needed to be awarded a clearance, that's the challenge, okay? And then the last thing, the bonus, I want you all to think about this. What are the 3 words that every transition team dreads? You don't want to hear it. You are scared of hearing it, and nearly every time you're going to hear it. So we'll think about that when we get closer. So let's talk about the timelines. Here's the transition timeline, a little bit of information about it. You have the election day, and then from there, you have what's called the certification process. And the certification basically says, yes, the election was free and fair. So it could be a day. It could be a couple days. In the case of Donald Trump in 2020, that certification process was extremely extended. Extremely extended. The longest certification that I know of in recent history. Then you have your transition. You've got somebody who is now the president-elect, and you've got the outgoing president who's still trying to make the government run every single day. Inauguration Day, January 20th. Why do I remember that? It's my birthday. I say, my birthday is so important they decided to inaugurate presidents on it. So, Chris, did you have something? Okay. Inauguration Day, January 20th. That is all. I think in one case it occurred a day later because of weather or something. But January 20th is Inauguration Day. So from election to January 20th, that time frame does not move. And it can't move. All right? So Inauguration Day, the incoming president goes in there and says blah 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 blah. So help me God, congratulations, Mr. President or Miss President or Madam President or whatever you want to call it. At that point, you are now the president, and the person who was the president isn't. So way to think about it. And then in the post-inauguration, you try and figure out a way to keep things running while you have this entire transition going on. Okay? So I'm going to turn my camera off so you guys don't have to worry about this. But in the pre-transition period, what happens? Pre-transition is we have had the election. Now what? Or we're getting ready for the election. What happens if this person gets elected? Oh, this person is, that's why they say certain people are allowed to be president. Somebody once said a while back, Arnold Schwarzenegger. What if Arnold Schwarzenegger runs for president? Well, he was an Austrian citizen. He wasn't American born. He was born in Austria. Does that make a difference? And the answer is yes. You have to be born, as far as I remember, you have to be born in America to be president. You can't have immigrated and still be the president. In fact, that was the whole, and I don't know, we're getting into politics here, but there was what was called the birther movement, where people were saying that Barack Obama did not prove that he was born in America to somebody's acceptance, at the level of acceptance. They're like, show us your birth certificate. Well, he did. But anyway, so then you have the certification. And the certification, I don't know if you guys have heard this, but who certifies that the election is official and ready to move forward? Do you guys remember? Who makes it official? Well, number one, the vice president arbitrates over the certification, but the certification is actually made by the Director of General Services, the GSA. Just a little bit of tricky information there. So you talk about money, what will it take, how much will it cost to do a transition for, and remember, this isn't just the president. This is the entire cabinet. All the people that work for the president, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, the Secretary of Education, the Secretary of Agriculture, all of those, they're going to change as well. Likely they're going to change. So if there are, and we experienced this with Donald Trump, if there are delays in the certification, everything else has to speed up. It doesn't delay the end. It just makes less time to get everything done. Okay? Make sense so far? Anybody have any questions? Comments? Okay, cool. Strict segregation. This is something I wanted to point out. It is almost comprehensive. In other words, if you are the incoming Secretary of Health and Human Services, you probably have found and are trying to get somebody vetted as your deputy, but then the challenge is you can't go into the Department of Health and Human Services and walk in the door because you're not the secretary yet. You don't work for Health and Human Services yet. So the incumbent, the person who sits there in the secretary's office, and the deputy secretary, their special assistants, all their senior executives, etc., and their presidential appointees all stay there until Inauguration Day, and then they're required to submit their resignations. When they do, and I'm going to show the next screen, now you have your new secretary who decides whether or not to keep you, the deputy secretary, the special assistants, etc., but they're now all under that new secretary. And the former secretary, the outgoing secretary, may take a little time to fully depart, so you have to set up an office and phones and email for them as well. But they can't be in the same place. I'm going to give you a really good example. When I was part of the transition for DOD, the Secretary of Defense transition between Bill Cohen and Donald Rumsfeld. Bill Cohen was departing when, in the year 2000, when George W. Bush was elected president. Bill Cohen was departing as the Secretary of Defense. Donald Rumsfeld was coming in. Great. The problem is that Bill Cohen specifically said, no one outside of my office will have access to my calendar. Can't see it. So guess what? Bill Cohen's calendar program, the software that ran Bill Cohen's calendar, was prohibited from being accessed by anybody from Donald Rumsfeld's team. So you had to stand up literally 2 Secretary of Defense calendar systems because the old one was not available to the new guy. So that's a big challenge. You are not the Secretary of XYZ until Inauguration Day, and you're sworn in. If you're not sworn in, then the old guy, whoever that is, or gal, whatever, is still the secretary. So it's very interesting. Also on the networks, you don't have a Department of Defense login if you don't work for the Department of Defense, even if you're the incoming Secretary of Defense. So from a security standpoint, and here's where we get to cybersecurity, from a security standpoint, how do you maintain 2 secure yet segregated network systems in your organization? Big challenge, something to think about. Funding and other logistics, and I'll sort of go through this one kind of quickly, but Bill Cohen, when he first came in, his transition team was 8 people, I believe. Donald Rumsfeld, when he came in, had 32 people on his transition team. And it got to a point, I mean, we set up for, I think it was 16 people to be in this transition team. And very soon it became apparent that that wasn't enough. Well, the money would only accommodate a certain number of people. So there were literally people in Donald Rumsfeld's incoming transition team that said they would work for free. How do you handle volunteers that don't officially work there yet? It's a real challenge, but that's what happened. People said, okay, well, then I'm going to work for free, because they knew at some point they were going to get jobs with Donald Rumsfeld. But how do you handle that logistically? Security clearances, access control, all that sort of stuff for a volunteer. Just something to think about. And then these days, we have what's called BYOD, bring your own device. What if, somebody walks in and they say, well, I want to be able to hook up my Android phone to the calendaring system. And oh, by the way, they're not even employees yet. You have to think through these things before somebody sits down at your desk and says, I want to do it. You have to be prepared to respond in advance. Okay? Computers, isolated network drops. Literally, when you plug your computer into the wall, if you're in the transition team space, it goes to a different network. It goes to a different network, a temporary network that you've stood up just to make sure that not only are the current network devices going to be safe, but the new network devices are going to be safe. And they're also segregated from each other. It's like you have firewalled the old from the new. And then how do you handle GFE? GFE. It's a term that we use a lot in the government. Government furnished equipment. How do you issue somebody an iPhone, for example, when they're a volunteer? And I'm just using that as an example. So you see the challenges as we're going through this. Here's another one, security clearances. Everybody has to have either a approved security clearance, an awarded security clearance, or what's called an interim clearance in many organizations before they get their login account. So, for let's say the incoming Secretary of Defense, you have to have finished that person's security background investigation before inauguration day. And all of the people that he wants to bring on. So you could be doing background investigations for people in the transition team. Some of them are going to come on as staff, but others aren't. So, in the midst of it all, you're not treating everybody identically. Each person is treated individually. And you've got hundreds of them all occurring at the same time. And here's one. I wanted to share about this one. Chris, I don't know if you even remember this. Unexpected logistical challenges. The U.S. Department of Labor is located in what's called the Francis Perkins Building, 200 Constitution Avenue Northwest. There we go. 200 Constitution Avenue Northwest, which is a block away from the Capitol. From the south-facing windows in the Department of Labor building, you can look and see the U.S. Capitol. When they do the swearing in the U.S. Capitol, you're going to have the incoming president, you're going to have the incoming vice president, you're going to have the outgoing president, you're going to have the outgoing vice president, you're going to have the, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. You're going to have all sorts of senators and, all sorts of VIPs, their families and everything. That is an opportunity for terrorists. So what they do is all of the buildings surrounding that space, they say, you can't enter that building from midnight the night before, whatever they set it up as. Secret Service decides that you can't enter that building. Well, there's a problem, though. I have to have people there to set up accounts for the new secretary, in this case, the Secretary of Labor, but I can't bring people into the building after midnight the night before until after the inauguration ends. So this is a true story. I had 2 of my help desk people go there the night before with sleeping bags and ordered pizza for dinner because after midnight, that door was locked down, no one was allowed in, no one was allowed out, and they had to be in there for the inauguration so that as soon as the president, so help me God, the president was sworn in, the president then turns and swears in their initial cabinet, and they go to their buildings. So the new Secretary of Labor walked into the new Labor building and wanted network accounts. So you had to be there. So we had a number of people from the Windows admins who were doing login accounts, asset management who were issuing laptops and iPhones, and the help desk who were trying to arrange it all. And they literally slept there overnight because that was the only way for them to be there when the secretary arrived. So just something to think about. Now, if your building was not within eyesight of the Capitol, it wouldn't have mattered so much. But for us, it did. Just something to think about. How do you do a transition if you can't bring people into the building? So when we talk about clearances are based on need to know. And if you've ever watched movies, you see somebody, they pull out a gun and they say, I need to know, or whatever. Well, that's not how it works in real life. Need to know, and your background investigation, there are strict laws that govern that. So there's a risk if you grant somebody an interim clearance, they get access to certain things, but then later on down the road, the clearance doesn't pass. So when you're doing the security background investigation, you have to forecast whether you think the clearance is going to be awarded. And if you think there's a good chance it's going to be awarded, then you can award the interim clearance. And then later on, the background investigation catches up with that, and you get an official clearance. But you do not get network accounts until you get either a official clearance or an interim clearance for your federal government agency. You just don't. They can't say, well, this person has a need to know. Tough. They still have to go through the background investigation. Okay? All right. That was everything I have except for the 3 words every transition team dreads. And I bring this up because I've heard it multiple times. I did presidential transitions, cabinet level transitions in the Department of Defense and in the Department of Labor. So I've watched this occur. What do you think a transition team, you're the IT support team, you're setting up, everybody's iPhones and laptops and getting everything ready to go. A new senior exec, let's say the Deputy Secretary of U.S. Department of Agriculture, walks in the door. What are the 3 words the transition team hopes never is said? Ideas. Chris, you've heard this one, but anyone else? What 3 words? Take a guess.
Something about passwords?
Passwords? No. No. Come on, take a guess. Chris, when we did it last time, you said the network is down or something like that. No, hopefully not. But as a transition team, you're expected to meet the requirements of your new boss. And what happens if your boss walks in the door and says, "Where's my Mac?" And you are a 100% Windows shop? How do you speak to that? And I've seen it occur over and over again, because you have your secretary, you have your deputy secretary, and then you have all of their senior advisors, senior executives. And frequently, those senior executives, hey, I learned on a Mac. Hey, I use a Mac at my previous job, so I want a Mac here. And you're basically trying to tell somebody who's going to be the director of a few thousand people that they can't have a Mac because your organization isn't set up for it. It's a tough conversation to have, but it occurs over and over and over again during presidential transitions. Macs are not PCs, and few networks are set up to accommodate both. Very few networks. So how do you handle that? You're standing there looking at the guy that's going to run everything for your 1,000 people in your organization, and oh, by the way, you're about to disappoint him or her. So the transition teams dread somebody walking in and asking this, and nearly every time someone does. So you've got to think that through and say, how do I say that we can provide security for Windows systems, but we are not set up to accommodate Macs? It would be way too expensive for us to do this. That means you need your CISO there to be able to say the business benefit of having a Mac versus the risk or the cost. It just doesn't make sense for us to give you a Mac. Hard sell, but it does happen. Okay? Does anybody have any comments, questions? Was this fun? Because if you are doing this in a corporate sense, you don't see this. But this sort of stuff happens up in what's called the boardroom, because they're like, okay, well, I'm getting ready to leave, And, frequently senior executives give a month notice before they go, and they're trying to get somebody else in there, but the new person is not the CEO. The new person is not the chairman of the board. So how do you work those things out? Comments? Anybody?
One of the things that's more interesting in this go around, and this what happened also in 2020, if you go back to the timeline, Scotty, we're in a situation right now where the election is going to be contested. Therefore, you have to plan for 2 transition teams to be in that second phase, the certification phase and the transition phase before Inauguration Day. And you almost want to sit there and say, hey, Scotty, on your timeline, you may want to add a dot that says when the election results are certified and stamped and approved. And that might be the milestone after certification and transition plans from there. But if you look carefully, and this is public information, what I'm about to share, there are some discussions about who's coming in and if they're following the plans or if they're still discussing with one of our administrative offices how they're going to do those plans. And when you have a contested election like that, you're going to have a scenario where both transition teams are there to discuss the transition plans with the executive departments in our transition team. So this is interesting. This timeline is just general. Hey, if everything goes great and wonderful, the challenge here is going to be, this is going to be contested. We're going to probably have 2 transition teams, and you got to do your best to keep the smiley face and still help them out. And
because January 20th.
I don't want to go further than that because I'll go deeper into our dark weeds that I don't want to share on a recording.
January 20th is looming. Good point.
Right. January 6th, I think, is the election. I think one of those days, either January 6th or December something, is when they certify the election results. January 5 or January 6th. I want to say January 6th, but I think there's also another date. I have to go back and look at my timeline.
Yeah, but a lot of people don't realize this, but the certification is done by the director of the GSA. There was a big deal about Donald Trump pressuring Mike Pence. The vice president accepts the certification. The vice president, I don't know if everybody understands this. In the Senate, you have a total of 100 senators. So it's possible you can have a 50-50 tie because there are 50 states and every state gets 2 senators. So it's possible you could have a 50-50 tie, and it frequently happens. If you have that, the deciding vote goes to the vice president. So as you're doing it, go ahead, Chris.
What if the vice president is a nominee to become president?
Yeah, right. It gets challenging. It gets very, very interesting. But in the case of, like you were saying, a contested election, the director of the GSA is the one that examines everything, not the vice president. The GSA director examines everything and says, was this a free and fair election? And when GSA certifies it, they send it to the vice president who accepts the certification. Yeah.
GSA is our auditors, by the way. Our internal auditors.
Yeah, and federal buildings, for example, are owned by the GSA or leased by the GSA. The Department of Defense doesn't.
GAO is our auditors, not GSA. I got those confused. Right.
Services includes logistics like military bases. Military bases may be operated by the Department of Defense, but they're owned by the GSA. So it's kind of cool. You don't own land as the Secretary of Defense. all the land in the federal government, and that includes national parks, whatever. The White House, GSA owns them. So, big deal. All right. Did everybody enjoy this? Did anybody have any questions or comments before I turn off the recording?
Great insights. Was great talk. Thank you. Yeah.
Is it helpful, you think, maybe?
Yeah, it's opened my mind.
Yeah, you literally have to think about things before they occur. That's the only way to be successful. You can't wait for it to happen, because by then it's too late. So, okay.